You reek of rural trash. Get your filthy face out of this boardroom right now. Yeah. The venomous scream shattered the solemn silence of the most expensive executive suite on the 80th floor of a Wall Street skyscraper. Brad, the arrogant head of human resources at the elite financial firm Apex Capital, stood towering in a $5,000 bespoke suit. His face was flushed red with pure disdain. With a brutal flick of his wrist, he slammed a scalding cup of Americano straight into Ethan's face. The dark, scorching liquid splashed across Ethan's worn-out white shirt, staining the faded $3 tie he had bought from a local thrift shop. So that exact moment, Ethan's resume was ripped in half and tossed carelessly into the trash can in the corner. Ethan stood dead silent. Hot coffee dripped slowly from his chin onto the polished marble floor. Around him, 5 elite job candidates from New York's upper class, dressed in designer suits and sporting luxury watches, muffled their disgusting sneers. La familia. Brad glared at Ethan as if he were a disease-ridden pest that had accidentally wandered into the sanctuary of the ultra-rich. Look at yourself. You pathetic worm. Brad stepped closer. Ziana, pointing his diamond-ringed index finger aggressively into Ethan's chest. Where do you think you are? This is Wall Street. This is where million-dollar minds and elite bloodlines rule the global financial market. Lowlife from a rusty auto shop in rural Ohio, wearing rags like a homeless beggar, actually thinks he can walk in here and become a quantitative analyst. Brad turned to his assistants and the upper-class applicants, bursting into a booming laugh. Get the hell out of here before I call security to throw you into the street like a stray dog. Ethan didn't cry out. He didn't even rush to wipe the hot coffee stinging his skin. His eyes remained eerily calm. He stared straight into Brad's cruel, arrogant eyes. If Brad only knew the story behind this faded suit, if he only knew what had transpired 5 years ago in a tiny, forgotten town in Ohio, would he still be laughing so arrogantly? Flashback to 5 years ago. The impoverished town in Ohio was buried under the freezing snowstorms of a Midwestern winter. Ethan lived in a dilapidated wooden house with a rusted tin roof. 18. While kids his age in New York were being bought sports cars and preparing for Ivy League universities, Ethan was working 18 hours a day. Freezing early mornings, he drenched himself in filthy engine oil at a local auto repair shop just to earn a few pocket change dollars. Every single night, under a dim oil lamp and in the biting cold, Ethan sat collapsed beside his mother's sickbed. His beloved mother was battling terminal cancer. The monthly bills for medication, dialysis and hospital stays were a crushing mountain of debt on the shoulders of a teenager. To save his mother, Ethan had no way out. In that cramped room, smelling of grease and cheap medicine, Ethan taught himself. He collected discarded books on advanced mathematics Nyaya probability theory, computer algorithms from thrift shops. The entire town was fast asleep. Ethan was still typing tirelessly, line by line, on an old second-hand laptop assembled from scrap parts. He realized one brutal truth. The financial world doesn't run on kindness. It runs on mathematics and algorithms. He, a poor kid abandoned by society, possessed a natural genius for numbers that no expensive university could ever teach. Then, single-handedly coded a revolutionary quantitative trading algorithm, a system capable of predicting financial market volatility in milliseconds before it actually happened. He used that algorithm to make his very first dollars, La Sagrada Familia, paying off his mother's medical bills and keeping her alive through the cruelest days. Fate never seemed to smile on Ethan. 5 years of relentless effort. Every drop of sweat and blood poured into that auto shop. Every sleepless night behind the keyboard. All aimed toward one single dream, a ticket to Wall Street. He submitted his portfolio to dozens of financial giants. Finally, Apex Capital, New York's premier hedge fund, sent him an invitation for the final round of interviews. To afford a long-distance bus ticket from Ohio to New York and buy a second-hand suit from a thrift store, Ethan had to sell the only watch his late father had left behind. He boarded the overnight bus, clutching his algorithm documentation tightly to his chest, naively believing that in a land of freedom and progress like Wall Street, true talent would be respected. Little did Ethan know, the multi-million-dollar boardroom on the 80th floor was not a place to honor talent. It was an arena of humiliation, a Sagrada Familia, where the powerful used their leather boots to stomp on the dignity of the weak. And the man leading that cruelty was Brad. Back to the present moment in the boardroom. Seeing Ethan's unbothered expression, Brad felt even more offended. He sneered, stepped up to the desk, grabbed the torn pieces of Ethan's resume, slammed the shredded paper straight into Ethan's face. "What are you staring at? Are you upset?" Brad yelled, his voice dripping with authority. "I am the HR director here. I decide who lives and who dies in this company. Rural trash, like you, is only fit to be a janitor sweeping floors. You dare dream of becoming a financial analyst? Get out of my sight before I ruin your life forever." Su entusiasmo. La Sagrada Familia. Ethan stepped through the revolving glass doors of the 80-story Wall Street skyscraper. The air inside was freezing, smelling of expensive polished marble, imported leather, heavy luxury perfume. Towering crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting sharp, cold light onto the golden elevator banks. This was the temple of elite power. A place where billions of dollars were moved with the press of a key, and where the rich decided the fate of the poor without ever seeing their faces. As Ethan walked across the grand lobby, his second-hand leather shoes made a quiet, squeaking sounds in against the immaculate floor. He clutched his worn canvas briefcase tightly against his side. Immediately, The security guards in tailored black suits stared at him with cold suspicion. 2. Young female receptionists in immaculate designer blazers whispered behind their hands, casting disgusted glances at the visible coffee stain on Ethan's collar and the faded fabric of his pants. Them, he was an eyesore. An intruder who belonged in the alleyways sweeping trash in the heart of global finance. Sitting, Ethan ignored the staring eyes and stepped into the private elevator, going straight to the executive floor. La Familia. When the doors opened on the 80th floor, he was ushered into a grand waiting room overlooking the New York skyline. Sitting around the glass conference table were 5 other candidates. They were all young men and women in their mid-20s, dressed in bespoke suits from Savile Row, wearing Rolex and Patek Philippe watches on their wrists. They talked loudly about their Ivy League degrees from Harvard and Yale, their family estates in the Hamptons, and their summer trips to the French Riviera. When Ethan sat down in the corner, the room went dead silent. The other candidates moved their chairs away from him, covering their noses, as if Ethan carried a contagious plague. Is security letting homeless people in here now? One candidate whispered loudly, chuckling Sagrada Family. Did he buy that suit at a yard sale for $5? Ethan remained seated, staring straight ahead, his face an impenetrable mask of absolute composure. He didn't come here to make friends. He didn't come here to fit into their hollow world. He was here for something much bigger. 10 minutes later, the double doors of the main boardroom swung open. Brad stepped out, surrounded by an entourage of junior executives and assistants holding iPads. Brad didn't even look at the other candidates. His eyes locked onto Ethan, like a hawk targeting prey. The arrogant HR director held Ethan's printed resume between 2 fingers, holding it away from his body, as if it were dripping with filth. Ethan Vance, Brad announced, his voice booming across the quiet floor, dripping with venomous sarcasm. The boy from the Ohio junkyard. Step into my office. Ethan stood up calmly and walked into the grand boardroom. The room featured a 20-foot mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire financial district. As soon as Ethan stepped inside, Brad didn't offer him a seat. Instead, Brad threw the resume onto the table and leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs arrogantly. Let's keep the pleasantries, Ethan, Brad sneered, resting his chin on his hands. I looked at your application. No Ivy League degree. No connections at Goldman Sachs. No family legacy. Lose, your father was a bankrupt, blue-collar worker. Your mother died in a public ward. Offend. And you dare apply for a senior quantitative analyst position at Apex Capital? Bro. Brad leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure malfit. Do you know what Apex Capital represents? We represent the top 0.1%. We only hire the elite of the elite. Bloodline matters. Ethan, social status matters. A stray dog, raised in the dirt of Ohio, will always remain a dog, no matter how many books he reads. Okay. Rat picked up the single piece of paper containing Ethan's math test results. A test Ethan had scored a perfect 100% on, and slowly, deliberately, ripped it in half right in front of Ethan's face. You don't belong in this building, Rat said softly, dropping the torn pieces onto the floor. You are an insult to everyone in this room. Ilya. Ethan stood frozen in the center of the mahogany-paneled boardroom. The cold glare of the ceiling spotlights cast long, harsh shadows across his face. His eyes remained eerily calm, reflecting the custodiara, reflecting the cold blue light from the digital stock ticker running across the wall. Brad folded his arms across his chest, leaning back against the edge of the conference table with a sickening grin. What's the matter, kid? Brad taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing that someone like you doesn't belong in the same stratosphere as the people in this room? The 5 other Ivy League applicants let out low, cruel chuckles, adjusting their expensive designer cuffs and shaking their heads in disgust. Brad walked toward Ethan, his shiny Italian leather shoes clicking loudly against the floor. He stood just inches away, looking down his nose at Ethan's coffee-stained collar. Let me tell you how the real world works, Ethan, Brad whispered, his tone laced with toxic condescension. In this city, money isn't just power. Money is oxygen. And people like you, you're just taking up space. You come from nothing. So you feel you have nothing. You will live here with nothing. Yeah. Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't blink. Because, as Brad's cruel words filled the room, Ethan's mind wasn't on the coffee stain on his shirt. His mind was back in a sterile, tight hospital room in Ohio, 3 years ago. Like Faniflia, a memory that Brad had long forgotten, but one that was burned into Ethan's soul in letters of fire. 3 years ago, Brad wasn't just a ruthless HR manager. Dioso. He was a senior portfolio manager at a predatory Wall Street hedge fund. Back then, Brad had engineered a brutal short-selling raid on a small, family-owned manufacturing firm in Ohio, the very company where Ethan's father had worked as a lead mechanic for 30 years. To artificially inflate his fund's quarterly profits, Brad had deliberately manipulated market rumors, shorted the company's stock to zero, and forced the business into an abrupt, catastrophic bankruptcy overnight. Over 500 working-class families lost their pensions in an instant. Ethan's father, stripped of his life savings and disgraced, suffered a massive heart attack 2 weeks later and passed away in an overcrowded public hospital ward. Ethan remembered holding his father's cold hand as the heart monitor went flat. Custodia. He remembered the bitter tears streaming down his mother's face as they were forced to sell their home to pay off the lingering medical debts. And He remembered looking up the name of the man who had signed the liquidation order that destroyed his family's life. That name was Brad Miller. Brad had destroyed dozens of innocent lives from his air-conditioned office in Manhattan without ever seeing the human faces behind his spreadsheet numbers. To Brad, Ethan's father was just collateral damage. A rounded off number in a multi-million-dollar bonus calculation. For 3,000 days, Ethan had lived with that memory. He hadn't spent those 5 years in Ohio just surviving. He had spent them studying every single move Brad made. He analyzed Brad's trading habits, tracked his corporate corruption, and mapped out the financial network of Apex Capital until he knew the company's structural vulnerabilities better than its own board of directors. Ethan hadn't walked into this 80th floor boardroom as a helpless victim begging for a job. He had walked in as a man delivering a long overdue bill. "Are you deaf, Vance?" Brad's sharp voice snapped Ethan back to the present. "I told you to pick up your trash and get the hell out of my building." Ethan slowly raised his head. His dark eyes locked onto Brad's with an intensity so sharp, so cold, that Brad's arrogant smile subtly faltered for a fraction of a second. "You think this is about a job, Brad?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice dangerously steady. Brad let out a harsh, irritated bark of laughter. "What else would it be about? You're a desperate, broke nobody looking for a handout. Nah. You really don't remember, do you?" Ethan said quietly, taking one step forward. 3 years ago, the Midwest, precision manufacturing liquidation. Brad paused. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, followed by a dismissive shrug. "I've liquidated 100 useless Rust Belt companies. You think I keep track of every failed factory in the middle of nowhere? Ilka." "I know you don't," Ethan replied, his tone remaining ominously calm. "Because to you, human lives are just numbers on a screen. But numbers have a habit of balancing themselves out in the end." Sagrada Familia. The atmosphere inside the 80th floor boardroom instantly turned ice cold. Brad stared at Ethan, his jaw tightening as a red flash of pure anger crept up his neck. He didn't expect a broke kid from Ohio in a $3 thrift store tie to stand his ground, let alone speak to him with such cold, unwavering authority. "Are you threatening me?" Brad snarled, taking a threatening step forward. See, his multi-$1,000 watch caught the harsh fluorescent light. "You think some sob story about a defunct Rust Belt factory gives you leverage here? You're nothing. You are a bug underneath my shoe." Brad turned back toward the mahogany table, looking at the junior executives and the 5 arrogant Ivy League applicants who were watching the scene unfold. A cruel, malicious idea formed in Brad's mind. He didn't just want to kick Ethan out. He wanted to destroy his spirit entirely. He wanted to humiliate him so deeply that Ethan would never dare step foot near Wall Street again. You know what? Brad sneered, walking over to the massive interactive glass whiteboard at the front of the room. He picked up a digital stylus and tossed it aggressively onto the table in front of Ethan. You claim you're a quantitative analyst. You think your little redneck brain can handle high finance mechanics? Fine, let's test it. Brad quickly tapped the screen, bringing up a complex, real-time financial simulation model. It was a live, stress test crisis simulation that Apex Capital's top quantitative engineering team had been struggling to solve for 3 weeks. A mathematical anomaly involving high-frequency algorithmic liquidity traps during market crashes. This is an active, quantitative crisis scenario, Brad said, his voice dripping with condescension. Our senior PhD engineers from MIT have been stumped on this for a month. Solve the differential liquidity formula on that board in 5 minutes. Do it, and I'll consider letting you apply for an unpaid internship sweeping our floors. Fail, and you get on your knees. Oh, apologize for wasting my time. Crawl out of this building. The other Apaclans snickered loudly. He's setting him up. One whispered. That's an unsolved stochastic calculus matrix. Nobody can solve that on the spot. Ethan didn't say a word. He walked calmly to the front of the room. His hand was steady as he picked up the digital stylus. He looked at the sea of chaotic algorithms, differential equations, and chaotic financial data points flashing across the massive display. To Brad, it was an impossible barrier designed to crush Ethan's spirit. To Ethan, it was elementary. Without hesitation, Ethan began to write. Daphania. His hand moved across the glass display with lightning speed. Zilamio. White. Mathematical symbols and algorithmic logic lines flowed seamlessly from his pen like water. He wasn't just solving the equation. He was rewriting the core trading logic from scratch. Within 60 seconds, the room fell dead, silent. The condescending smiles on the faces of the junior executives melted away. Their eyes widened in sheer disbelief as they watched Ethan effortlessly bypass the algorithmic liquidity trap using a revolutionary mathematical proof, a formula that bridged game theory with high-frequency, quantitative mechanics. Psycholo. The red error alerts flashing across the interactive screen suddenly turned green. The simulation settled. The liquidity crisis was neutralized. The system recalculated the projected returns, flashing a massive green number across the board. Plus 24. 5% optimises yield. Ethan stopped writing. He placed the stylus neatly on the table, then turned around and looked directly at Brad. Brad was frozen. His mouth hung slightly open, his face pale as he stared at the screen. He knew finance. He knew algorithms. He instantly recognized that what Ethan had just written on that board wasn't just correct. It was worth hundreds of millions of dollars to any hedge fund on Wall Street. Panic surged through Brad's veins. If the board of directors saw this, if senior leadership realized that this broke kid from Ohio possessed a mind far superior to Brad's entire management team. Brad's position, his authority, and his inflated ego would be shattered. He couldn't let this happen. Jake, Brad suddenly screamed, his face contorting into a mask of rage as he lunged forward. You memorized a lucky solution. You cheated. Say, in a frenzy of desperation and malice, Brad slammed his hand onto the control panel, wiping the entire whiteboard clear, erasing Ethan's brilliant work in an instant. Before anyone could react, Brad grabbed a fresh cup of dark, say, scalding Americano coffee sitting on the conference table. With a wild, cruel gesture, Brad hurled the hot liquid straight into Ethan's face. You reek of the filth of a rural garbage dump. Brad screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls. Get your disgusting face out of this meeting room immediately. The dark hot coffee splashed across Ethan's cheeks and poured down his front, thoroughly soaking his thrift-to-store shirt and turning his paper, thin tie into a soggy mess. Brad grabbed the remaining pages of Ethan's printed documentation, ripped them to shreds, and slammed the paper scraps straight into Ethan's chest, letting them scatter across the wet floor. Security, Brad roared, Lesagda, pointing his shaking finger at the door. Get in here right now. Throw this trash out onto the street. If he resists, break his legs. Ethan stood motionless in the center of the grand room. Coffee dripped from his chin onto his shoes. Shredded paper lay scattered around his feet. The elite applicants erupted into cruel laughter, pointing and mocking the ruined young man. Brad leaned in close, his face inches from Ethan's, breathing heavily with victory. You see that, kid? Talent means nothing on Wall Street. I own this floor. I own this company. You are nothing. You will always be nothing. Ethan slowly wiped a drop of coffee from his eye. He didn't scream. He didn't fight back. Instead, a cold, soul smile formed at the edge of Ethan's lips. He checked his cheap wristwatch. 0 a.m., Ethan whispered softly. Brad frowned, confused by the sudden change in Ethan's demeanor. Sagradafo, what the hell are you talking about? Market open, Ethan replied quietly, looking up into Brad's eyes with terrifying calmness. And your 5 minutes are up, Gloria. Ethan didn't blink. He didn't make a sound. He stood calmly amidst the puddle of dark, scalding coffee on the floor, surrounded by shredded papers. As Brad's hysterical screaming echoed off the glass walls of the 80th floor boardroom. Brad, panting heavily, his face flushed with triumph, turned back to his team of junior executives. You see that? Brad boasted loudly, pointing his thumb over his shoulder at Ethan. That is what happens when street trash tries to climb into the penthouse. Throw him and throw him out. 2 burly security guards in black suits stepped forward, reaching out to grab Ethan by his arms. Ring, ring, ring. Suddenly, a piercing, Lie. Priority emergency alarm chime erupted simultaneously from every smartphone, tablet, and terminal in the room. The junior executives froze. Brad frowned, reaching into his tailored jacket to pull out his encrypted company phone. The screen was flashing, crimson red. Read it with an urgent Bloomberg terminal broadcast notification. A suffocating silence dropped over the boardroom, like a heavy lead sheet. Brad's thumb trembled as he tapped at the screen. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. "What is this?" Brad stuttered, his arrogant voice suddenly cracking. "That's impossible. We are a $40 billion fund. Who could buy 51% of our parent entity in 15 minutes? Nonna." It failed before anyone could answer. The heavy, double oak doors of the boardroom were thrown open with violent force. A group of 6 high-ranking corporate lawyers in dark charcoal suits, led by the chief legal officer of Wall Street's premier law firm, marched into the room. Sagrada Familia behind them walked 3 senior members of Apex Capital's board of directors. Their faces were pale, clenched in cold sweat, their hands visibly shaking. Brad Miller, the board chairman, barked, his voice laced with absolute panic. "Stop whatever mindless nonsense you are doing right now." Brad recoiled, stumbling back against the mahogany desk. "Chairman, what is going on? Market trading just opened, and our control permissions are locked out. Who bought the firm?" "Via." The chairman didn't look at Brad. He didn't look at the 5 terrified Ivy League applicants cowering in the corner. Instead, the chairman and the chief legal officer walked directly toward the center of the room. They walked right past Brad and Sagrada Familia, stopping right in front of the young man standing in the puddle of coffee. The young man in the $3 thrift store tie. The absolute horror of everyone in the room. The chairman of the board lowered his head and bowed deeply. "Mr. Vance," the chairman said, his voice trembling with profound respect and fear, "the transaction is complete. Quantum Trade Holdings has successfully acquired 51% of Apex Capital's voting stock. As of 9 a.m. today, you are the majority owner and newly appointed executive chairman of this firm." Brad's mind shattered. His eyes bulged out of their sockets as he stared at the elderly board chairman bowing his head before Ethan Vance. The silence in the grand 80th floor boardroom was so heavy, so suffocating, that you could hear the slow drip of coffee falling from Ethan's ruined sleeve onto the marble floor. No, that's an error," Brad shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched scream. He lunged forward, grabbing the chief legal officer by his lapels, his face twisted in utter hysterical denial. "Look at him. He's a dirty redneck mechanic from Ohio. He came here in a $3 suit, begging for an entry-level job. He just poured coffee on himself. He's a nobody. He doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together, let alone billions of dollars. For my The chief legal officer coldly slapped Brad's hands away with disgust. "Control yourself, Mr. Miller," the lawyer said, his voice dropping like an iron gavel. Quantum Trade Holdings is the proprietary algorithmic hedge fund that took Wall Street by storm 18 months ago. Its core quantitative engine, the most profitable trading algorithm in modern financial history, was registered under the sole intellectual property of Ethan Vance. The lawyer turned, opening a sleek leather briefcase, lay a Sagrada Familia, and pulled out a stack of notarized legal documents bearing the golden seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. 15 minutes ago, Mr. Vance executed a leverage buyout of Apex Capital's parent entity, LA. He converted his quantitative equity into 51% of all voting shares. Every asset, every trading desk, every executive position in this company belongs to him. The 5 elite Ivy League applicants in the corner went dead white. The 2 burly security guards, who had been about to tackle Ethan, instantly took 3 steps back, dropping their heads in terror. Brad felt the room spinning violently around him. His knees buckled, and he had to grab the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. He slowly turned his head to look at Ethan. Ethan hadn't moved. He reached into his coat, pulled out a simple linen handkerchief, and calmly wiped the remaining coffee from his hands. His posture was perfectly straight. His gaze was cold, unyielding, and terrifyingly powerful. You're the founder of Quantum Trade?" Brad stammered, his body shaking uncontrollably. The arrogant, ruthless tyrant who had been screaming insult after insult just minutes ago was gone. In his place was a pathetic, terrified coward. "I told you, Brad," Ethan said quietly, his voice echoing across the silent room. "La Sagrada Familia number a habit of balancing themselves out." Brad suddenly dropped to his knees. The sound of his knees slamming onto the hard marble floor rang out clearly. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, reaching out toward the hem of Ethan's coffee-stained trousers, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "Ethan, Mr. Vance, please," Brad wept, his voice dripping with pathetic desperation. "I didn't know it was a test. I was just testing your humility. I swear to God, I didn't mean any of it. Please, I have a family. I have a mortgage on my Hamptons estate. You can't destroy me." Ethan looked down at the man groveling at his feet. There was no pride in Ethan's eyes. There was no joy. There was only the absolute cold execution of justice. "You didn't care. You didn't care about my family when you liquidated my father's factory 3 years ago," Ethan whispered softly. "You didn't care about humility when you threw coffee in my face 5 minutes ago." Ethan stepped backward, pulling his shoe away from Brad's trembling hands. "And your judgment begins right now." Brad froze on his knees. The cold marble floor felt like ice beneath his palms. He stared up at Ethan with bloodshot, panic-stricken eyes, his hands trembling violently as he clutched at the air, trying to find words that could save his pathetic skin. Ethan, please. Dad whined, his voice high-pitched and cracked with terror. We were both men of finance. We understand how the game works. Sagrada Familia Vini, I was under immense pressure from the board back then. I was just following orders during the Midwest Precision takeover. It wasn't personal. It wasn't personal. Ethan repeated quietly, his voice echoing through the silent, glass-walled boardroom. Ethan slowly turned toward the giant interactive glass display on the front wall. The very same display where Brad had just erased Ethan's algorithm solution moments before. Ethan reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black encrypted flash drive. Tuagde, he plugged it directly into the master terminal under the main screen. Let's see just how impersonal your trading history really is, Brad, Ethan said coldly. The single tap on the glass screen, the entire whiteboard lit up in bright crimson red. Columns of encrypted financial data, internal wire transfers, offshore bank account records, and private audio transcripts flooded the display, illuminating the faces of everyone in the room. The board chairman leaned forward, his eyes widening in complete shock. What is all this? The chairman gasped. Ethan pointed his stylus at the first cluster of documents. These are 5 years of internal compliance audits from Apex Capital, Ethan explained, his voice razor-sharp and articulate. Over the past 60 months, Brad Miller hasn't just been running HR and trading operations. He has been systematically running an illegal front-running network. Ethan swiped his hand across the screen, bringing up a series of offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Every time a retail investor or a small Midwest business applied for a credit line or a restructuring loan through this firm, Ethan continued, Brad illegally leaked their confidential financial data to short-seller hedge funds. He shorted their stocks, drove their valuations into the dirt, then bought back their liquidated real estate assets at pennies on the dollar through shell companies registered under his brother-in-law's name. Brad's face drained of all color. His skin turned a sickly, ghostly gray. He slumped back onto his heels, staring at the screen as his entire empire of lies was dismantled in front of the board. Lay, Sagrada Familia, his colleagues, and the junior applicants he had looked down on just 10 minutes ago. You didn't just ruin my father's factory, Brad, Ethan said, turning his cold gaze back to the groveling man. Silay, you illegally siphoned $32 million from hard-working middle-class pension funds into your private Swiss accounts. La Familia. You bought your Hamptons mansion with the stolen life savings of honest mechanics, factory workers, and nurses. Yes, it's all fabricated. Brad shrieked, scrambling to his feet like a cornered animal. Yet, he looked around wildly at the junior executives and the board members. He's making it up. He hacked our servers. Don't listen to him. No. Click. The heavy double oak doors at the back of the boardroom clicked open once more. 4 federal agents wearing dark suits and gold badges pinned to their lapels stepped into the room, flanked by 2 armed officers from the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. The lead FBI agent held up a signed federal warrant. Brad Miller, the lead agent announced, his voice booming with unquestionable authority. We have a warrant for your arrest on 12 federal counts of wire fraud, insider trading, securities manipulation, and grand larceny. Leo. Brad